I think we are ready to go as long as Mr. Verma is ready, I guess.
I am.
Yeah. So before
Yes.
we go into the lecture, I would like to share a few words about uh, architect Rohan Verma. He has been graduated with a first class honor from the University of Mumbai, and then he received a master's in architecture with honorable mention from TU Delft. And he was also a Tata and Mahindra scholar. Then he is currently working as a practicing architect. His firm's name is Verma Architects, which is based on Mumbai and Amsterdam at the same time. And also he is working as a researcher, a lecturer in the Department of Architecture at TU Delft. During the students' visit in Sylhet, the students group came from TU Delft. They are working with the global housing issues, and this year the study is based on Sylhet city. So we are really lucky to have architect Rohan Verma and other faculties from TU Delft, along with architect Merina Tabassum from Bangladesh, and all the students. We are eagerly waiting for the outcome and further collaborations. And Rohan Verma also engages with academic and public writing. Like I mentioned before, I have read some of the articles, and also we have received a book where he is the editor, and also he's working with Professor Degven Gameran and co-authored the book of Living Ideas and co-curated our international traveling exhibition on the housing designs of the Indian architect Charles Correa. And more recently in 2020, he was appointed as Delft Global Fellow. And in 2022, he, along with his colleagues at TU Delft, won the Global edX Prize for exceptional contributions in online teaching and learning for the course Global Housing Design. And in 2023, he was appointed as an editor of the journal Delft Architecture Studies on Housing. We have received a copy of that book. Plenty of detailed drawings and studies are like compiled there, and I believe we will be able to collect other editions of that book. So thank you for the contributions so far to our students, our departments, and also to the city we're living in. And special thanks for allowing us to have you for a lecture today. So I am requesting architect Rohan Verma to move on to the lecture, and also please keep some time for our students and our colleagues so that we can ask a few more questions after your lecture.
Yes, of course. No, thank you. Thank you so much. No, thank you very much for that very kind introduction and also for this invitation. I'm really happy to be able to do this. It's really wonderful to do this. Thank you so much. It's been, what is it now, 3 months, maybe 4 months since we were there in Sylhet. But we all have very wonderful memories of being there, and our students, and I'm glad to see some of them have joined this talk. They're all busy, of course, developing their projects, and Correa's work is very much present in a lot of the student work that we are developing. And yeah, maybe Professor Dikwan Khamran and I have something to do with that, because we're so fond of Correa's work that we can't stop talking about it even in the studio. But it's really nice to be able to do this and to see people interested in learning more about the work of an architect who I think remains a very essential field of study. I think his portfolio is really special in the sense that what he did with his work is to really show this patient search for optimal models on housing. It's a very good example, I think, his portfolio of the importance of research, the importance of design, but also of research by design. That's really, I think, coming across very clearly in his work, and something that I think students can pick up on and learn from. The other thing, of course, that I want to touch upon, and the title of my talk kind of gives that away, is that I think he had this remarkable, in fact, fairly rare ability to oscillate between scales. So he understood the importance not just of the detail or the scale of the dwelling, but also the importance of what makes cities, what makes communities. And there are not many architects who can oscillate between this very wide spectrum. And something that will become clear, I hope, as the lecture progresses, is the importance of looking at both ends of the spectrum to understand housing as very much an architectural challenge, but it's also a planning challenge. And as someone who was both an architect and a planner, he was able to draw connections and learn from these very opposite ends of the spectrum to produce projects that I think still are very valid and still hold a lot of lessons. So the presentation is more or less based on this exhibition and book that Professor Van Gameren and I put together. This was in 2017 and 18. And why is it called Living Ideals? Well, in a way, I've already spoken about it. We think that Correa's ideas and the ideals in his project are still very valid. And they're valid not just for the context of India, where, of course, much of his work is located, but really, I think, resonate with many parts of the world, Bangladesh, but students of ours who do projects even in places like Addis Ababa or Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires are equally inspired by his work. So I think the kinds of projects and the ideas embedded within Correa's projects are very much alive and very much valid even today. So this was really an exhibition that we initially intended only to be in Delft. It was mainly about bringing Correa's work to a Delft audience, to an audience here in the Netherlands. And the top left photograph is an exhibition of is a photograph of the exhibition we put together in 2017, so now 7 years ago. But what happened was that we were invited by Nandita Correa Mehrotra, who's the director of the Charles Correa Foundation, to bring it to India. And then it traveled. It traveled to Mumbai, it went to Kolkata, it went to Ahmedabad, and finally found a more permanent home in Goa, in the Correa Foundation there. So the presentation is very much drawing on that exhibition and the book that we put together, which is what you see on the screen here, and it's a book that we sort of felt would be important to put together because I think his housing work has not been in that sense studied in isolation in as much detail as we think it deserves. So this is a first start, and hopefully maybe next year we'll develop a more thorough book on his housing that goes into a lot more detail. But for the moment, what we did was to put together this book that obviously looked at archival work. It even has working drawings, which I think are usually missing in most monographs. But it also looked at how the projects have developed today, because there's a lot of lessons and learning from looking at how these projects are now currently used by people. So how did this all begin? Well, of course, as was mentioned, I did work for Correa for a couple of years. And then after my master's, Professor Van Gameren had this idea of organizing a conference on dwelling in Delft. This is 2014, so now 10 years ago. So we asked Correa to come and be the keynote speaker, and we were very lucky and happy that he agreed to do that. This is just a year before he passed away, and he wasn't keeping good health even then, but he did come and he spent a whole week, and that was a really wonderful week to have him in Delft to obviously lecture at this conference, and he gave a couple of other lectures as well. But it became the foundation on which a lot of the studio work that we now do is all based on. So the Global Housing Studio was very much in its initial period in 2014, and having him come to the faculty and talk about housing and issues of urban planning, I think really set the stage. It really gave us a very clear direction in terms of where we could even take our academic curriculum. So that really was the first connection that we made with him in Delft. And then, as I said, just a year later, he unfortunately passed away. In fact, just a few months before we were able to publish this book, and he was one of the contributors to this book. It's the journal that was mentioned also in the introduction, a journal called Dash. and every issue deals with a different theme. And in 2014, 2015, we dealt with the theme of affordable housing. Unfortunately, he passed away before this was published, but as a kind of tribute to him, we put one of his most famous projects, probably the most famous affordable housing project of his, that's Belapur, on the cover. And the book, of course, went into this overview of affordable housing experiments around the world. It covered all the major continents and looked at about 12 or 13 projects and discussed them in detail. But we found that his work and his ideas were very much, let's say, worthy of further investigation. One of the things that we did also in that book, in that journal issue of Dash, was that Professor Dick van Kameren and I, we wrote this article together. We called it Shifting Scales. And this article essentially was looking at the development and the history of affordable housing design in India. And in that sense, if I may be able to say this, but I think India is really a very fertile ground for mass housing experimentation. It certainly has been that, starting even in the colonial era with the Bombay Improvement Trust and the kinds of chawls that they built, but really post-independence, this movement of modernizing the country, industrializing the country that Nehru initiated, really also meant that housing was seen as part of this larger social program of the government. And in that sense, the young architects of that generation found very interesting patronage in order to build a lot of the housing projects that we will see in this lecture. So this article was really looking at this overview, this history. And again, Correa's work was very much coming back again and again as a central area of study. But like I mentioned, this period just post-independence was a very interesting period for Indian architecture. And what you had were these young architects who were sent abroad on scholarships, who went and studied at universities in the UK and the US particularly, and then came back and became part of this nation-building movement. So you have Habib Rahman, who was one of the very first Indian architects to go across on a scholarship provided by the government. The top left photograph, that's Habib. And that's a photograph of him at his studio at MIT. And this is 1944, it's just before independence. Following in his footsteps was Kanvinde, who went in 1946. He studied under Walter Gropius, who had come from the Bauhaus, and even worked, I think, briefly in his office at in the States, but he studied at Harvard. And then, of course, Doshi, which is who's a well-known name in South Asia. Doshi went across to the UK and happened to meet Corbusier there at a conference, and then found his way to his office in Paris, where he worked, I think, for Corbusier for a total of 7 years before coming back to India. And then Correa on the bottom right, he studied at the University of Michigan and at MIT. But the point was that they were all exposed to this foreign education, to these to learnings from masters like Corbusier and Bucky Fuller and Gropius, but they came back. They all went back to India, and they were part of that first generation that helped build a free and modern, independent India. And that was an exciting time because you had, patronage of the kind that we see in this photograph. You had Nehru, who was, as I mentioned earlier, was putting India on this path towards industrialization, where he saw architecture very much as a tool for nation building and as a tool for expressing the ideas of a free and independent nation. So, the building of Chandigarh is very much a result of that larger ambition, political ambition, but also social ambition for modernizing the country. And that was, of course, a watershed moment in our history, the building of Chandigarh. And of course, the plan is a plan that I think most architects anywhere in the world are very familiar with. And that really is, when you think about Corbusier and Chandigarh, you think about the plan. But you also think, of course, of his capital complex. And these are the two scales at which Corbusier really focused his and centered his attention on. And it had a huge impact on the kind of architecture that was built in India post that period. In fact, I mean, it's a fantastic photograph of the Secretariat in Chandigarh. And this really, if you look at almost all government buildings built in India in the 50s, 60s, even 70s, they are sort of hand-me-down versions of Cobb's Secretariat in Chandigarh. In fact, Correa, who was a young architect, and he never worked for Corbusier, but he did meet him in Chandigarh quite often whenever Corbusier was in the country, was very much also inspired and influenced by Cobb's thinking. This is an article actually that he wrote in 1964 when he was a correspondent for the Architectural Review, where he is talking about the assembly building in Chandigarh. And as I said, the arrival of Corbusier in India, but also later Khan, just as the impact he had in Bangladesh, could be found in projects across the country, particularly in the larger cities like Mumbai and New Delhi, where new buildings, new institutional buildings, new government buildings needed to be built. And you can see this very direct Corbusian influence on a lot of the work that was built by the government in those first couple of decades after independence. And here you see again, why was that? It was because they had the patronage. They had the patronage, with Nehru there at the center, being very involved and interested in architecture, in issues of the built environment, in institutional building. And that's where, architects like Kanvinde and Doshi and Correa found the opportunities they needed as young architects to really experiment with ideas of combining what they learned in the West, but responding as well to the practicalities and the climate and the context of India. Now, this is, of course, the lesser known aspects of Chandigarh are the housing sectors. We all focus on the large plan, the main plan, the master plan by Corbusier. We also focus on the grand buildings, like I showed you a couple of slides earlier. But the lesser studied, and I think the more interesting areas of study, for me at least, in Chandigarh are the housing sectors. And this wasn't developed by Corbusier. I mean, of course, they had to fit within Corbusier's plans, but they were developed mainly by his cousin, Pierre Jeanneret, but also the English duo of Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry. And together they built this incredible catalog of housing types that went all the way from housing for the ministers and the high-level bureaucrats, all the way down to more working class houses, even for peons and the lower paid staff that all were living and working in Chandigarh. And that's actually a more representative view of how Chandigarh looked. So it's not just the capital complex, but most of Chandigarh looked like this. These were neatly laid out sectors with low-rise, fairly high density housing, not as high as some of the projects we'll see in the lecture from here on, but very much low-rise, responding to budget constraints, responding to climatic considerations as well. And this is one of those plans that I was talking about. It's type 13. There was a whole catalog that went from type 1 to 13. And the peon houses are one of the more basic, or if not the most basic, house type that they developed within this catalog. And it's interesting because it's of course laid out in a very efficient manner. And it is, I'll see if I can even scribble on the screen. Let me know if you can see it, but it's basically about developing this row housing typology, which is of course the most efficient way of laying down houses, because you can then enable the most number of houses to share resources in an economical and minimal manner. And you had essentially the living zones at the start of the house, at the beginning of the house, the entrance somewhere there. you had an open to sky courtyard, and at the back is where you had the bathrooms, the kitchens, sorry, not the kitchen, but the bathroom and the toilet and the wash area. I hope that the scribbles I make are even visible on the screen. I think they are.
Yes, it is.
They
What's
are. Okay.
behind that zone?
Out here?
After, yeah,
Yes. So that was just a sort of storage area, another patio, and then you would have actually more housing that was developed here. So just a mirror.
I see.
So this would be the basic block, and then you would kind of lay them out in this direction and then mirror them even in that direction. And this became the basic type that you see even in the photograph out there. So it's a very efficient way of laying down housing, of course. And you see the materials they use, it all came out of a lot of study. In fact, Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry were working in Africa before they came to India, and they brought all that learning as well into the design of these blocks, housing sectors in Chandigarh. Now, what's interesting, and this is something that we in Delft love doing, is to do this plan analysis, which is to see, the kind of family history of housing types. And the one on the left, of course, is the peon housing that was developed in Chandigarh. But the one on the right is a project that was built about 10 years later in Ahmedabad. And this is a project by Doshi. But essentially, it's very much the same, because you have here in Doshi's scheme a similar tube, a long parallel unit, where again you have the living spaces in the beginning, then you have this open to sky courtyard, and then you have the wet zone at the back. But what he did was to, well, obviously also club them together, but he staggered them. So this set is accessed from here, and then this set is accessed from there. So you don't get a front yard, backyard layout, but you get a kind of, both streets are given equal importance, in other words. But at the scale of the dwelling or the scale of the layout, it's very much the same as what you find in the peon housing. And if you look at Correa's very first housing scheme, it's also doing the same thing. So you have Doshi on the right, and this is Correa, where again it's a long tube with the living spaces here in the front. You enter the house from there. You always have a kind of entry area. Notice as well the way the walls are detailed. They're both projects, this idea of having inbuilt furniture, not just making flat walls and you go and put an ugly cupboard, but you really also then design the inbuilt furniture as well. And he's doing very much the same thing as Doshi and what we found in the peon housing. But you have these living areas in the front. In fact, this is a bit longer. So you have the kitchen and some storage spaces here. But then you have this courtyard as well, or this patio, which is partly open to sky. And at the back, you have again the WC and the wash area, the bathing. So it's very much the same kind of linear arrangement that they developed over time. And that's what we found interesting. And what we tried to put together in this issue of Dash was to look at this, as I said, this kind of history, this family history of types, and to see where these ideas come from and how they get developed over time. But of course, for this essay, it was a quick overview, and we looked at some key examples, by Doshi and by Raj Rewal and P.K. Das. But what we found, of course, is that Correa's work is a recurring theme. So if I was to highlight his projects, in fact, even that one is his, it would be, yeah, these are all his ideas, or rather his designs. So we find that across decades, he is really developing a very rich, but also a very consistent portfolio, where you can see the development of ideas in a slow, gradual way, being fine-tuned by an architect with every commission that he gets. He's developing them, he's improving them, he's learning from them, and then they're resulting, in a lot of cases, unbuilt works, as we will see in the presentation, but also built works, where the lessons from previous projects inform later projects. And that's that's interesting as an architect because, of course, when you're starting out, especially a lot of your work doesn't get built and you feel very disheartened, but actually you shouldn't feel disheartened because the projects still have a life. No matter if they're built or unbuilt, they have a life, and therefore they inform the work that you do even in the future. So Correa's work in that sense is kind of coming out of this tradition, this modernist tradition, having studied in the West and being influenced by Corbusier's presence in India, but at the same time, he's also critical of Corbusier. He was never, what in India you call it chela. He was never just blindly in love with Corbusier. He was also able to critique him and to see where perhaps his ideas weren't working for a place like India. So, this quote from 1971, and I'll read it out, where he says, "For it was the building of Chandigarh, a catalytic decision by Nehru, which brought the people of India face to face with that strange animal, the world of Corbusier. Not that life in Chandigarh is utopian, far from it. The dust-catching brise soleil, the medieval segregation of social classes, the lack of public transport, all are appalling." So it also shows you someone who was very inspired by Corbusier, but also able to critique him. And I think that's important. It's not just to look at someone's work and say that, yes, everything they did was great, but to understand maybe perhaps also where they went wrong. And that's okay, because then through that critique, you might be able to improve and find your own voice. He was also very critical, particularly when it came to Corbusier's ideas on mass housing. And that snapshot, which is a caption from a book called The New Landscape that Correa wrote in 1985, in a way summarizes what he thought about Corbusier's ideas, particularly when it came to the issue of mass housing and city planning. He asks, Corbusier's hand, is it creating life or is it destroying it? So, in his work, what we find is really this development of ideas, as I've been talking about. And you can see, the project that I showed just a minute ago, that long linear tube in section looks like this, which is really based on ideas of climate. And what you find is that even in later projects, it's the same idea. Now, the one on the left is low-cost housing built for very poor sections of society. And the one on the right is perhaps the most expensive piece of real estate in Mumbai, certainly when it was built in the 1980s. But the ideas are the same. So irrespective of building for the rich or the poor, he was driven by the same idea. So he didn't see a difference, in other words, between designing for the rich or designing for the poor. Everything from the cross ventilation to even the way that he organizes these split levels and mezzanines comes back in projects that are built for an entirely different social class. And that, again, is something that I think students and young architects can learn from, to not see these divisions and not to see as one thing being completely separate and isolated from the other. Or take, for instance, this is maybe an even more interesting example. This is one of the most basic housing schemes in his portfolio, which is squatter housing. It's just 10 feet by 10 feet or 3 meters by 3 meters, just these simple square units clustered with a small courtyard of the same size in front. And at the same time that this was being designed, I think this was 1972 and this was maybe 73, if I'm not mistaken. This is the residence for the Prime Minister of India. So this is a residence for Indira Gandhi that was designed just outside New Delhi. But it's the same. It's the same. It's the same almost in terms of scale. Both projects were to use just brick and mud. He saw no difference. In fact, he wanted to show that the residence for someone as important as the Prime Minister of India should not be some opulent, grand, big villa or bungalow, but should be the exact opposite. It should be almost village-like in its form, but also in its material, because that would make a political statement and then become far more relatable to the people of India than any kind of grand Lutyens bungalow could be, for example. Or you take even a scheme like this, where you have these complex sections stacked and staggered, but you find that he's also developing those ideas for not just housing on the left, but also for a hotel, for a high-end five-star hotel. It's the same kind of idea. So it's not just in terms of housing where these ideas show up, but also in terms of, hotel design. It's very much the same mind. And lastly, this scheme, which is a very basic kind of layout of a small house, um, how does this dwelling fit within that master plan? Which was going back to an earlier point I made, where he was able to oscillate between these two ends of the spectrum with almost equal command. Again, like I said, a rare feat. And that's because he didn't see architecture and cities as two isolated entities, right? And as the quote on the screen also suggests, buildings do not exist in isolation, but in the larger context of our towns and cities. And this is the context which is being destroyed day by day, as it is in so many other cities of the developing world. And that's, something, of course, that we can relate to. That's also why I think we have a lot of common ground and why we can all learn from each other. But you see his mind. He's an architect, but he's also a planner, and he doesn't see a division between those two roles. In fact, he sees it as an opportunity. And this is a quote that I really like, which again, I think is very good for students and young architects to see and to learn from. And I'll just read it out if you don't mind, where he says, architects are often involved in a number of different assignments at the same time. And this can be an advantage. An idea you've been dealing with at the scale of an outhouse suddenly becomes relevant a day or an hour later when you're looking at a whole township. Or perhaps conceptualizing a new museum typology, and the other way around, of course, up and down the scale. So you see, he's really, not interested in a portfolio or running an office that comes down to doing just a single type of building. And a lot of contemporary offices and a lot of stuff we see on Desingns and Arc Daily are offices that are good at doing one thing. And he came from an era where the architect was very much a generalist. And unfortunately, we're moving towards a world where everyone asks you, oh, you're an architect, what do you specialize in? And that's something he would never do. He really saw the architect as a generalist, someone who could do many things, and doing those many things sort of helped you become better at all the different tasks and all the different kinds of commissions you had. And that's something that, of course, is too much to get into in just one lecture, but just to keep at the back of your mind that he wasn't just an architect who was interested in housing and planning, but also an architect with a capital A when it came to designing museums and other institutional buildings or office buildings. So as part of that Dash journal that we put together, I also interviewed Correa just before he passed away, just a month before he passed away. And we worked on this document where, again, as you can see, he was dealing with these two ends of the spectrum. He was talking about the growth of Bombay and New Bombay or Navi Mumbai, which is an idea that he spearheaded, but was also talking about the scale of housing. So he was able to really oscillate between those two scales. So what we did in the exhibition was to put these projects in this chronological order and to find the families, the kind of affinities between different projects. And we did this, and we realized that there are these four basic themes that we can find in his work. It's the climate section, the community space, incrementality, and clustering. And what I'll do is to go into each of these themes in a largely chronological order, but it'll be very much structured according to these four themes. So just to start off, what really drove him, right at the start of his career was looking at vernacular, looking at the vernacular and learning from the vernacular. This is an image he would always have in his presentation slides, which is an image of Sindh in what is now Pakistan. This image of these wind catcher houses where in a hot desert climate, you have these wind scoops and they help draw in air. The air gets channeled downstairs to the base of the building, where often there's even a a body of water which helps create a microclimate and then cools the rooms in the house. And it's something like this that he found to be even more inspiring than, let's say, Corbusier's work, because Corbusier, as we know, famously said, "A house is a machine to live in." But he would always argue that even Corbusier never produced anything as beautiful and evocative, as expressive as something as this, which is something that exists in vernacular, and it became really for him a point of reference, a point of yeah, a place that he or something he would study to inform the projects he was working on. So one of the very early projects that he did, it's not a housing project, but it's a pavilion. It was a temporary pavilion designed for a fair in New Delhi called the Hindustan Lever Pavilion. But although it looks random, and to an extent maybe it is, in fact, it's a precursor of what we call deconstructivist architecture. You look at the work of people like Libeskind. Well, this happened way before Libeskind entered the scene. But while it might look like these random shaped, RCC folded plates, it actually, again, borrows from this, because he's looking at this and creating this and saying that, well, how can you scoop air in? How can you channel air through a building? How can you use the form of a building to allow the air to escape, to therefore create convection currents, to create breeze? That is really, what he would call form follows climate. And as we know, in the 1950s and even earlier, the modern movement was dominated by the slogan, form follows function. And what he would say is that, no, 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 form follows climate. And this is a very interesting project that is developed along that theme. And you can see the working drawings. I mean, also put yourself in 1958 in a poor country like India, which didn't have the resources that now may be available, but really to get this built without computers, without any kinds of softwares that we all now use so easily, but to produce this and to actually execute it was quite a remarkable feat. You see a photograph of what it looked like when it was built. But the point is that the same idea that you see in this pavilion is also coming through in his housing work. So it's the same, the tube house that we've already looked at, the long parallel walls, allowing air to come in and letting it escape, is very much the same thing that's also happening here in this project. So it's using architecture, but using, a commission you might have to also inform other work. And at the very core, he was interested in sustainability, but sustainability without the tag of, like now everyone uses that tagline, it's sustainable or not. But this is what he was trying to do. He was trying to respond to climate, but using form as a way to deal with climate. So this is the first scheme that we look at. That's the tube house, and it's clustered around the central courtyard. And you can see, how those parallel units come together. But it's very much, based on this idea of form follows climate. And what's interesting, of course, is also that he understood the limitations of space, of resources, of money, of budget. And what he did, for example, to divide spaces rather than put up walls, was to just introduce slight level shifts in the house. So these one-step, two-step kinds of shifts that he would have in the floor plate actually helped demarcate space. It meant that you were able to divide space by these small shifts through the house, which is something that we can all relate to in South Asia. But the other thing, of course, he also did, realizing the limitations of a very tight site. So this is just about 3 meters, and I think it's about 15 or maybe 16 meters in length, is that he understood that the same space will be used in multiple ways at different times of the day. So there's a daytime section, and there's also a nighttime section. So the same living space, and this is, of course, something that we're all very familiar with, living in South Asia, where the living room could also become a bedroom in the evening and things of that sort. But he uses that to produce a certain kind of design. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. Unfortunately, only one of these houses was built. It was actually a competition in which Jane Drew, and I mentioned Jane Drew and Convinde, both of them were on the jury. They selected this project as a winning entry, and they, allowed or enabled him to build this prototype. Unfortunately, it never went beyond the prototype. So only one was built and lived in for a number of years, and now it's demolished. And in its place have come more conventional apartment walk-up apartments that you see in the background, which is quite a shame, because one of the arguments he was trying to make was that you didn't need the walk-up apartment with a lot of space around it. What you could do was to build low-rise, high-density patterns, which would achieve the same density without having to have a walk-up apartment. But unfortunately, that was never executed in its entirety. The project remained just one prototype. But you can see, even at the scale of the prototype, there's really a kind of attention to detail. Like every square inch is used, every square inch is thought of either as structure or as storage space. There's a kind of it's almost like product design where the louvers are designed in a certain way to provide shade, but also to let the air go through. There are niches for storage. And in that sense, it's obviously a project with a very low, limited budget, but has been thought through in a lot of detail. Now, as he developed this, the municipal authority asked him to design another project. This is called Gujarat Housing Board 2. In fact, this is Gujarat Housing Board 1. But what he did with this second project was that he understood the limitations of having just a single bay. So rather than just a single width, he explored the idea of having a more cruciform shape where these slightly more expanded spaces would create better living conditions and would not be so limited just with that one single width. So this became a kind of variation on the tube that he had developed. And you can see how he begins to stack, or rather stagger them in plan. And in doing so, he's got 2 or 3 types. So this is one type, the most basic type, that's the cruciform type. But here's another one with the addition of this, and here's another one with the addition of this. So there are at least 3 types within the scheme, but they're staggered in plan to create this linear arrangement, which is never just strictly a straight line. So it's always got some kind of insets and spaces that can then be used for different kinds of activities. So rather than just build one very strict, wall of housing, it's staggered and planned to create more usable and different kinds of spaces. But you see in the section, of course, the idea is very much also still there, this idea of a scoop and allowing the air to kind of pass through, creating those convection currents. And you see them better in these photographs of the model. Now, what's interesting is that, like I was saying earlier, he didn't see a difference between designing for the poor or for the rich. So at the same time that project was being developed, he was also asked to design this house for a very wealthy merchant client in Ahmedabad. So all of these projects are in the same city, where again you can see those scoops coming back, and of course also the linear plan. It's the same, but now just for a wealthier client, so it becomes larger and more expressive. Perhaps you have better quality bricks, and the detailing is quite spectacular. But elementally, it's the same project, with the difference, of course, being that now, with the space and budget that he has, he develops a typology which is wider, and therefore has these 3 bays. So you can see these 3 different bays. So the very first bay is where you enter. So it's got the service area, it's got the pantry, the kitchen, the entry porch, and then the other 2 bays are for the more living spaces, the dining areas, the living rooms, etc. But again, it's a fantastically detailed project. You can see that very much in the working drawings that are all available in the archives with the Charles Correa Foundation. But it's also about beauty. It's not just conceptually strong, it's also materially very well detailed. And it is just a beautiful project. Just, especially for anyone who's been in Ahmedabad or understands what it would be to be in a house in a very hot and dry kind of climate, that house is a refuge. It's a place where you can go. It's sheltered from the sides, and you get light filtering in this really poetic, beautiful way, as you see in this photograph here. Now, he takes this idea of the multiple bays and develops another project, but this is now a project for middle income housing in Mumbai. And he has now a wider bay than the ones that we've been seeing in Ahmedabad for low income housing. And what he introduces is a clear kind of arrangement of two bays, a narrower one and then a wider one. So the narrower one becoming the service bay, again, with the kitchen, the staircase, small study, and then the bigger spaces in the house, like the living and dining areas, all being occupied in that wider bay. But what he also does is to use the site, which was gently sloping, to create these level differences. So what happens is that when you enter the house and you want to go up, you go up half a flight of stairs to this room, you go up another half a flight of stairs to that room, and then another half a flight to get to the terrace. And of course, the terrace is open. But also what that does is to create a kind of section where there is a more protected interior, which is all of this, and a more open to sky terrace, which can be used in the evenings, which is here. So he's beginning to also respond to the different moments of the day and night, but also to different climates and to different seasons. And you see here the similar attempt in terms of staggering the units and plan. It's never just along the straight line, but it's very much about creating these differences, which allow for obviously different kinds of space. It's never monotonous. There's always a rhythm to the projects. Another interesting thing, I'm not sure if it's big enough to see, but if you read that, you will see an interesting name. It's Correa Doshi and Associates. And that's something that not a lot of people know, is that in this time, I think it was the late 60s, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, the late 60s, 67, 68. They actually attempted to start an office together, which unfortunately never went beyond this one project. In fact, this project was not even built. But there was an attempt to create this partnership. In fact, Doshi was the best man at Correa's wedding. So they were not just colleagues, but they were also very good friends. And you see the working drawings. So it did go to a certain level of detailing in terms of design, but unfortunately it didn't get built, which is really a pity, because this would have been, the opposite of what happens typically in Mumbai, which is walk-up apartments or high-rise, high-density housing. And this simply as a type almost doesn't exist in the city, and it would have been a wonderful addition in the city had it gotten built. But you also see now in this model the introduction of a theme that we will see in a lot of his work, which is the introduction of this community spine. And that's something that we will see again and again in his work. But before we get there to the community spine, just while we're on the topic of the climate section, this is an interesting diagram where he is again exploring the kinds of forms he can create using space while responding to climate. So he says, well, if you have a typical roof, you kind of absorb a lot of heat if simply there's nothing above. The sun's rays over the course of the day will heat up your rooms. You could mitigate that a little bit by having a secondary skin, a kind of sunroof, which is elevated slightly, which could deflect part of the heat away from the house. But if you were to raise that even more to make it a habitable space, then it can also become a terrace. And by making a terrace, you have, again, an additional room on the top of the house. So he's using ideas like this to create sections, what he would call, over the course of the next 2-3 projects, summer section and a winter section. And you see that very clearly in this house. So we're back in Ahmedabad, again, a hot, dry climate. And you see again this plan with these 3 bays, service bay, and then the what he called the summer section and the winter section. So the summer section, of course, is protected from two sides and is sandwiched in the middle. So you're trying to stay away from the heat as much as you possibly can. Ahmedabad is a place where it can easily go up to 45, 46 degrees in the summer. And the winter section is more exposed to the elements, where particularly in the evening and in the winter months, you would like to be. So the summer section is actually this closed off pyramid here, whereas the winter section is the inverse. It opens up. And as we know, even in a place like Sylhet or Dhaka, the best place to be in the evening is not inside in a stuffy room with a fan or with the air conditioner on, but to really be on a terrace, because the weather is pleasant and it allows for that. You can't do the same here, you'll freeze. But certainly in much of South Asia, this is a kind of section or a typology that could work very well. And you see the built expression of this idea. Again, it's beautifully detailed. It's not just conceptually strong, but I think it's also materially very well thought through. So that's the kind of service bay in that corner. The summer section is somewhere there, and then closest to the open space on here on this side is where the winter section is. So the winter section has all those open terraces. Can imagine a wonderful kind of cocktail party in the evening happening in a space like this. And you see the kind of shade, shadow, beauty in architecture. It's not just conceptually strong, but also, I think, very expressive. And at that same time, as you would have seen, a lot of his work is in Ahmedabad, even though he was a Mumbai-based architect. And at some point, he thought of building a house for himself as well in Ahmedabad. And he came up with this plan for his house where he combined those two sections, but now in one linear form. So they kind of happen, well, just one behind the other. So the summer section is here, and then sandwiched right next to it is the winter section. But basically, you could use these different spaces in the house, not just seasonally, but over the course of a day. You could spend the daytime in there, and then in the evenings move towards that part of the house. So this idea of a kind of almost polycentric movement within a house. But this idea that we have on the left is very much also explored in this larger township called the Cable Nagar township in Kota in Rajasthan, which is again a hot, dry climate, almost desert climate. And you see the development of this idea in a section like here, where you have this terrace and then the living rooms or the living spaces below. And again, variations of that same thing, that same theme, also in different unit types. So going from the most basic, which is a single room dwelling with a terrace, to more elaborate layouts, to the most elaborate. So units, row houses for the engineers of this township that was being developed. And again, like I was saying with the Punjab enclave scheme a few slides ago, was this community spine. And this community spine is something that we will see more and more of in his work, particularly, most famously, in his scheme for Previ. Now, this is him moving away from India. In fact, his first international project. I'm not sure if many people have heard of Previ, but it was a competition that was organized in 1969 by the government of Peru. And they invited a number of architects, so really a kind of who's who of the architecture world at that time. So you had people like Aldo van Eyck from the Netherlands, you had James Stirling from England, you had Christopher Alexander, you had Fumihiko Maki and Kurokawa from Japan, the metabolists. So you had really the who's who of the architectural world coming together and landing up in Peru, in the outskirts of Lima, where there was this idea of building this experimental housing project, something like 1,500 dwellings on the idea that they should be able to grow over time. That was the brief. So the brief basically asked for incremental housing, which is, of course, a theme that's very much back in fashion these days. But in this scheme, you will find again, just like in the in the Punjab enclave, but also the Cable Nagar township, you find this community spine, and you find that very much happening here as well. But it's also developed on this idea of the Radburn principle. And the Radburn principle is this planning idea that comes from the United States, where you have this segregation between vehicular streets and pedestrian areas. So all the houses have two ends, one end facing the vehicular street on one end, and on the other, the pedestrian pathway. And just to kind of explain the plan a bit more, the road where the cars come is a cul-de-sac, so it basically ends, the dead end. And what that means is that at the scale of the entire township, then these community spines come together and then they link up. And I will show that in a couple of slides from here. But this is just an overview of the meetings of, it's a famous photograph of all of them sitting in a room participating in this competition, and then they were given a certain amount of time to come up with their ideas and proposals. Yeah, but you see Aldo Van Eyck here, and that's Correa. This is Christopher Alexander, and this is Peter Land, who was organizing the entire competition. And eventually, what happened was that they selected 3 winning projects, but they decided to not really, build only one. They decided to allow all participants, so that's 13 international and 13 local architects, to design smaller fragments across the land that they were looking at. So it became an interesting example, a kind of collage of many people working on the same site. So you had all of them developing their individual architecture projects, housing projects, but within the context of a larger master plan that was developed by Peter Land. And Correa's scheme is on this corner right here. And of course, you can see all the other famous names and projects. And all of this is well documented. So anyone who's interested can find books on this competition. And I think it's a very interesting experiment to have happened. But it's also very much built on the ideas that we've been discussing so far, the long linear tube, the climate section, the community spine. And you see some of the diagrams that he developed here. Learning from the limitations of the tube house and the very strict single bay, he's now developing these units that go from this, let's call it an L type, to a more S type, to a more T type. And he brings them together within clusters to create variation, to create diversity, and to create community spines and streets that are not monotonous, that are not just straight linear streets. You see, this is just an isometric of the same 3 types that are highlighted a few seconds ago. And that's how they all come together in the master plan. So the community spines, as I was mentioning, which are here, because the vehicular streets end there. They don't go beyond a certain point. But then all of this comes together. So at the heart of the project is also a kind of pedestrian car-free zone. That's a beautiful sketch of what it was intended to look like. And you see as well in this section, this idea of the wind scoop, again, learning from his projects in Ahmedabad, dealing with light, dealing with climate, creating convection currents, even in a place like Lima, which is again almost a desert-like climate. You see that better in these drawings here, the section. And of course, as I mentioned, this was a project that was a kind of hybrid between top-down and bottom-up. So designing something, building something, but also programming it to grow over time. So the growth aspect was absolutely central to the proposal. And they had to come up with options to show how that growth could actually take shape. Now, eventually, because of different reasons, costs, but also they had to respond to certain safety norms because Peru's well, as we all know, in an earthquake-prone area, that the plan changed, and eventually the plan became a lot simpler. So you had these units that were basically a bit like the Gujarat Housing Board 2 project, just kind of alternating between single and double bay widths, but staggered in plan, as we've seen in so many projects. And that's what it looked like when it was built, very pristine, modernist, clean. And that's what it looks like now. So over the course of, what is it now, almost 50 years, it's obviously grown, it's obviously changed. People have added floors. In fact, some of them have as many as 10 and 11 rooms, so they become large townhouses. Some of them have been even converted to small hostels because there's so much space and children have moved out that different possibilities and different income generating activities are possible. And the hand of the architect has almost disappeared. And in a way, that is really the success of the project. It's not looked at least to my mind, as a flaw or as a problem, but this was very much the idea of the project, that the hand of the architect would disappear over time, and it would be people who would appropriate their own spaces and shape their houses to fit their needs and requirements. The key, of course, is that the master plan remains. So the houses allow for a certain expansion, and then, of course, the open spaces remain intact. But this is also now almost the same time he's received this commission to design a large township in Mumbai called the LIC Colony, which is the Life Insurance Corporation of India, to design this colony where, again, it's almost the same plan. You have these units, just like in the Previ project on the left. You have these units which are arranged in staggered row housing configurations, and you have alternating pedestrian and street or car access. So the lines I drew are just the car access, and then in between all of them are pedestrian. So it's the same thing that you have even in Previ, with this kind of linear spine at the heart of the project. So you can see how he's using each commission to develop his ideas. And that's a snapshot of, or a sketch of, what it was initially intended to look like. It was quite a strong, let's say, design statement. These sloping, almost mountain-like dwellings, something that Bjarke Ingels these days is trying to do in Denmark, but this is 50 years ago. But a more, let's say, what eventually ended up happening was a more simpler arrangement of stacked units in this still, I think, quite beautiful terraced typology that we will look into. But again, going back to the idea of patronage, this is absolutely key, because it's, as I said, it was seen as a kind of nation building exercise. So it's a project that was, you can see Indira Gandhi's quote out there, it was very much part of the national agenda to build more housing. So it came out of that, let's say, context. And the focus was not just on housing, but on creating a township with open spaces, community spaces, schools, hospitals, and not just housing. That's the master plan that we've already looked into. I'm just going to go into two typologies here, the A type and the C type. And as I said, there was really a variation. There are 5 basic types in this project, but within them, a whole range, a whole catalog of different kinds of unit types that went all the way from modest 30 square meter units to much more elaborate 80 square meter or 800 square feet, 900 square feet apartments. And this is one type that I'd like to focus on, which is a type where actually it's not stepped, but it's just simply a walk up. It goes up 4 floors, so it's a total of 5 stories. But within it, you have a whole range of units. So you have an L-shaped unit here, and then you have a much smaller studio here. So there are 2 units on this floor, and then 1 unit here. You have stairs here and stairs here. So this unit is accessed from this stair. This unit is accessed from that stair. So using this very simple arrangement of modules, and each of these are just 6 meters, so 3 and 3. He is able to create a lot of variety in terms of unit types. And that's what it looks like. This has been built. It looks very much also like this sketch. And this is the other type. This is the type where you see the stepped layouts. And here, because of the steps, you get the larger units on the ground floor, I think 3-bedroom apartments on the ground floor. And as you go higher, they get smaller. But each of them get access to an open terrace in the front, which again, in a climate like Mumbai's, works really well. All the plans are very interesting, but to go into all of them would take up too much time. So just to give you a sense of what that looked like in terms of section, you see, of course, that a typology like this allows for a lot of diversity, a lot of variety. And that's what it ended up looking like, each house getting these open terraces, which of course, and these are photographs I took a couple of years ago, it's changed completely because of course people want to appropriate the space right in front and expand and extend their homes, which they have. And it actually begins to really look like a village. It begins to have a kind of almost vernacular feel to it. And it's green. It's a wonderful township to live in. If you live in a place like this in Mumbai, which is, increasingly very much all about the high rises that you see in the background, this is just a wonderful space to live in, where you have verandas and terraces and outside open space within your house. It's very rare. Interestingly, the project also had a sector or a fragment that was not to be sold. The rest of the houses that we've been seeing, which have been appropriated over time, are obviously owned by those people, but there was also a sector that was only intended for employees of the LIC. And there, of course, as rental accommodation, you cannot make those changes. You cannot add extensions or appropriate the space beyond very minor things that can be reversed. So you begin to see, even now, 50 years later, what it would have looked like in the 1970s. And that's quite, I would say, quite remarkable. Even at the scale of, let's say, a dwelling, there's a lot of design and thought that's gone through, because you have these kind of Dutch windows with these thin slits to just let in a little bit of light, but they're wooden shutters, so they can be closed off completely for privacy. And below that, you have the slit, which again allows a little bit of light to come in, but also you could open the little glass shutter there and allow the air to go through. So you could have your privacy, but you could also allow for ventilation. Even if you want privacy, you can still allow for air to come in. So there's thinking again at many scales. And too much to get into, but he developed this idea for a number of projects. This is for the same client, but in Bangalore. And you see the very similar kind of layout and very similar kinds of appropriation by people over time. And a similar, let's say, experiment also in the DCM apartments in New Delhi, where now rather than single units on a single floor, they are more complex maisonettes. So in this case, it's a series of 3 maisonettes. So that's 6 floors stacked one above the other. And yeah, beautiful plans as well. Again, you see the basic layout. It's a simple tube, but 2 bays that allow for all the spaces to be of a certain width and comfortable dimension. An isometric showing what that plan would look like. And of course, beautiful sections, creating a lot of differentiation and variety through this typology. But the point is, again, where does this come from? This section is almost identical to the Punjab enclave scheme that we saw from 1967. So he's using an old project to inform very much the ideas here. And this section is very similar to the section that we find here. So it's very much the same idea or the same theme, but now, of course, he's trying to innovate by seeing what would it mean to stack 3 of these one above the other. Now, another, let's say, section of that same project was also this typology that you find here, which is more high-rise. to enable for greater densities. And that, of course, is also the story of housing in India, that the densities and their requirements get higher and higher. They become more and more. And here he looks at the typical veranda, typical bungalow, to inform the design. And of course, in a bungalow, you have this wraparound belt that protects the interior spaces from the sun and the rain from all the sides. So he takes this idea and he develops a typology where the veranda becomes the key element. So you have these spaces here that become the spill out spaces for the apartment. And they work wonderfully well in the climate, of course, that we have in South Asia, but they also become spaces where you can extend your living areas onto, depending on the time of the day or depending on the need. And that's an idea that he also develops in Mumbai in this project called Rallis Apartments, where within this rectangular plan, he's come up with two typologies. These two are the same, but then there's a much bigger one, which is on this end. So it goes from 2 bedrooms to 3. But it's a scheme where, again, you see the veranda becoming a very key element of the design. That's really where the expression of the project comes. It's really from these wraparound spaces. And that's also an idea that he takes forward in Sonmarg Apartments, which is where he actually lived his whole life and where his wife still lives in Mumbai. And you see in the hatched area those veranda spaces that offer a kind of buffer between from the sun and the rain. And they become spaces where the house can extend. And in fact, over the years, the house has kind of expanded. So depending on need, very often, if there was a need for the bedroom to become bigger, it could expand there. Or if the living room to become bigger, it would expand there. This is, of course, a high-rise project built, and you get a sense of what that buffer space, the veranda space, could look like. And yeah, that's a fantastic shot. It's beautiful in the way that the light filters through those bamboo blinds, but you get a glimpse of the veranda space that lies just beyond it. And especially in a photograph like this, I like this photograph a lot because it almost makes me feel that you're standing in a bungalow on the ground floor, but actually you're on the 14th or the 13th floor. So it's really this bringing this idea of an Indian home or a bungalow, but in now a high-rise configuration. So he takes this idea and develops a series of projects where the veranda becomes now much larger terraces, double height terraces, in a scheme in Delhi called Tara Apartments, where again, it's maisonette. So each house is actually 2 levels with this double height terrace in the front. For different reasons, the plan of the layout had to be a certain way, that the rules of Delhi in terms of what can be built and not built were very strict. It led to a pattern of development like this. But you could say that it also draws from vernacular housing again, because this resembles a street in Jaisalmer or any part of North India for that matter. So you have the long linear types that are stacked or staggered next to one another, and you have the street in the middle. In this case, the project, of course, expands, and you have a more kind of generous community spine happening at the center, creating a microclimate. But also in terms of the way that the houses were designed was that in all these, in a desert climate, almost anywhere in the world, in a dense context like that of Jaisalmer or Jodhpur, you would have houses that kind of stepped in section, because then that provides shade on the streets below. And that again is something that he's doing in Delhi, which is also a hot, dry climate. So it's very much learning from vernacular to inform his designs. This is a group housing scheme, in fact, one of the very first group housing schemes in India. So the residents, the people who would eventually live there, were very much part of the project, even in its design and conceptualization stage. But you see what the project was finally going to look like, and these beautiful photographs of the model made back then. That's what it looked like when it was first completed. And these are photographs I took not too long ago to show what it now finally also looks like. In some cases, people have made these extensions on the top, but you see this microclimate that he was trying to create in the passageway inside, and it's a beautiful space to be in. And of course, on the outer ends where the terraces are, again, people have appropriated, extended, a lot like in the LIC colony we saw just a while ago. But staying with the veranda, he develops it even further, and I'm now nearing the end of the housing portfolio, and more or less nearing the end of the presentation. Don't worry, but it's realizing that the veranda it could even be further expanded to become terraces if you were to create sections like this, and then allow it to become a roof garden. So rather than it just being flat like this, you could have a section that was almost D-shaped, and then you could stack two of them together to create an kind of interesting interlocking pattern, which you have in this unfortunately unbuilt scheme for housing in Pune. That's what it was intended to look like, very cubist, very modernist, but really based on principles of an old Indian bungalow. And this idea is really taken to its absolute max in what is perhaps his most well-known project, which is Kanchenjunga Apartments in Mumbai. But it's really based on that diagram, on this idea of creating these double height terraces that filter the sun and the rain, act as a buffer space, protect the interior living spaces. And it's very much a variation or a kind of culmination of the very first tube house that we saw at the start of the presentation. It's very much about the cross ventilation and to create these level differences that allow for different kinds of spaces and to create a kind of sense of being in a bungalow or in a house rather than in a standard apartment, which could be just on one level. So that's how the project comes together. There are 5 basic unit types that stack in very interesting ways. It's a really complex section. For the exhibition, we had to build a 3D model of it on Rhino, which was, for me, just a nightmare. And it was even more of a nightmare for the poor model makers who built this model. And the model is quite tall. It's about 6 feet tall as I am. And it was really a puzzle to understand how the section works and how the plans work. So, it is very much, as I've been saying, based on the veranda, but it's also based on Corbusier's Unité in Marseille. You could say that it's a similar kind of scheme where Corbusier, you have these interlocking L-shaped units that stack to create that section. Beautiful, complex plans. Too much to get into, but these are all available in the archives, and you see what one of those apartments, this is the topmost apartment, the penthouse at the top. You can see the kind of space that it creates. It's really grand, and it's really a kind of bungalow in the sky. And that's what the project was kind of how it was advertised in the 70s when it was built, images of its construction. And that's what it eventually looks like. One could give a whole lecture just on this project. So I'm sorry that I'm skipping through. Subroto, how much time do we have? Because I think I need maybe 10 more minutes, if that's okay.
Oh, I think it is fine because I can see all the participants are constantly there. So I guess
they haven't fallen asleep. Good.
Yeah.
You never know on Zoom who's fallen asleep or not. So I'm glad that they haven't yet disappeared altogether. But yeah, that's what the project looks like. Have a sip of water. And it's really, you can see what the rest of Mumbai looks like, and you can see what this project looks like. It's a kind of tree of life. The only interesting thing, and then a kind of sea of absolutely banal high rises. This is an old photograph, I think, from the 90s. I mean, now they're even taller buildings, but sadly, none of them are as interesting as this scheme, as this project. So I'm going to end with just a few projects that focus again on low-income housing. And, this is 1972, 73. And in the office at the same time, he's developing this project, which is squatter housing, also in Mumbai. And it's remarkable that here's an architect who's building this brutalist concrete building in the city, but at the same time in the same city is also developing this plan, which is the most minimal, I think, example of housing I know. It's the simplest of units, just 3 by 3 meters, which we've seen, of course, even earlier in the presentation, that get clustered together in this plan that you see on the right. And I think it's remarkable for someone to oscillate between these income groups and to really change your hand depending on the context and the need of the client and the need of the project at hand. And he was able to do that. And I think that's, again, a lot of learning for any young architect. This is what that project was intended to become in terms of filling out an entire master plan. But it's really about dwellings within a courtyard. And as I mentioned, at the same time, in 72, 73, he's designing the residence for the Prime Minister, for Indira Gandhi. Now, this idea of dwellings in courtyards becomes more and more a theme in his very last, let's say, phase of designing housing. So you find these dwellings set within courtyards in this unbuilt project for Hatko in Jodhpur in Rajasthan. And if you were to see the working drawings, they're very simple. You can remember the drawings of the tube house, which are engineered, and really detailed out, and they have an elaborate section, which we've seen in all the projects that came before this. But now they become very simple. They're just, brick walls set in a courtyard, and with the idea that it could grow over time. So you see the low-income housing unit here, the middle-income housing there. The only difference is the addition of this extra room here. The high income is similar, larger in its plot size, but again, a very simple dwelling. And this idea is one that is repeated, let's say, in other projects as well. This is a township for a cement manufacturer, ACC. Again, it's just houses set within courtyards. So each house has a courtyard. So this house extends there, this house extends there, this house extends there. So it's just a collection of all these different houses set within courtyards that come together even in a cluster that creates a bigger courtyard in the middle. And this would be very much an idea that he develops again and again. In fact, in this one, 5 of these clusters come together to create a kind of community spine that's now no longer linear, but is arranged around these courtyards. But they're really all the same. It's just this, you see again, the repetition of the square. He was obsessed with the square, both in terms of the shape of a dwelling, but also in the shape of a cluster. But they're the same. So it's these 5 of these square clusters coming together. And you see that also in Kuala Lumpur. He gets invited by the government there to design housing in Kuala Lumpur. And it's a similar idea. It's dwellings clustered around a hierarchy of open spaces, of open to sky courtyards. And it becomes very loose. It's no longer this linear arrangement of very strict and, well, not strict, but let's say very detailed architectural projects with complex sections, but they're really basic units that are arranged in a plan that is almost village-like. And in fact, if you see the elevations, the sections, the plans, they're very simple houses. They're not overly complicated. They're very much more basic. They have sloping roofs. They respond, of course, to the climate of the place. And he moves towards a kind of shift away from the section, which had been the focus of all his projects so far, towards being much more now kind of oriented and based on the plan. The plan became the leading figure rather than the section. And this was taken, and this is the last housing project I'll show, it's taken to the absolute limit in this project called incremental housing at Belapur. And this is a project that all our students are very familiar with, but it's the same idea. But you see the genealogy, the kind of family history of this project and where it comes from. But it's really a project that's based on this hierarchy of open spaces that go all the way from a single dwelling which is there, and a dwelling that comes together in a cluster of 7. And then 4 of these clusters come together to create a bigger scale, and then it magnifies and then magnifies. And this hierarchy of open spaces is very much, let's say, something that he was developing over time, and saying that you really need to, when you're talking about housing, you need to create these hierarchies and expanding scales, because you need a degree of publicness and privateness. You need to go all the way from the private to the semi-private to the semi-public, finally to the public. And if you study the layout of any city that we like going to, whether that's Jodhpur, Jaipur, or Mykonos, one could identify these different layers of publicness and privateness in those cities. And that's what he tries to bring into a project like this. This is what it looked like when it was first built. This is a typical cluster. Again, the units are very basic. They're almost indicative. They were just almost, imagine that, okay, you could build this, but almost any contractor could build it. Almost any mason could put this house together. They're not very complex. They're very simple and easy to build and easy to expand. And that, again, of course, was one of the key criteria of the project, was this ability to expand them over time. This is a beautiful working drawing of what that scheme was intended to become and became. It developed a bit further to result in a scheme that's this. This is the final working drawing of the project that was laid out. In total, about 600 houses on a 6-hectare site, so about 100 houses per hectare. That's about 500 or 600 people per hectare. So it's a fairly large township, and all the gray spaces that you see there are special units, but every now and then you would also have a school or a small kiosk or a open space embedded within the larger master plan, which of course helps make habitat. And an important point is that there's a range of income groups in this project that goes all the way from the poorest sections of society to more middle income housing. So the units go from something like 18 or 20 square meters all the way to I think even 90 square meters. But you don't see a division in terms of plots. Typically in housing, you build low income in one section and middle income somewhere else and high income somewhere else. But no, he suggested that they all be built in this seamless master plan where you don't notice that actually there are 2 different grids. There's a bigger grid that's 24 by 24 meters and a smaller grid, 21 by 21. The middle income units that also have a range that goes from 50 to 80 to 90 square meters are arranged in this cluster. And the lower income units, which range from, let's say, 18 to 35 square meters, are arranged in this cluster. So yes, they are occupying different portions of the site, but you can't notice it when you're there on the site. It's a seamless master plan that allows spaces to kind of merge into one another, and you just walk in these community spines without realizing that actually the grid has changed. This is the manual or the kind of document that was put together when the project was being sold to residents. You see the units, the 5 basic units, but also quite interestingly, things like this, where you could choose your own door, you could choose your own neighbor. And the idea was that people would come together as larger groups and purchase a cluster together so that there's already a sense of community from the start. And it laid out, and you can't see it, of course, in that much detail, but there are specifications of what the materials would be, what the area statements would be, and so on and so forth. And that's what the project looks like. Now it's obviously changed. In some cases, the changes are not that drastic, but in many cases, entire homes have been demolished and in place have come urban townhouses. In fact, this is one of the original houses on the left, and that's come up right on a neighboring plot. And in fact, that's not seen as a negative, because that was also the whole idea of the project. Much like in Previ in Lima, it's the urban design that prevails and generates community. And the houses was very much, programmed to be morphed and even demolished and changed over time. So it's also about designing the unbuilt. It's not just about designing the built, but designing the unbuilt. And it begins to look like almost any Indian village. So just to wrap up his housing, how did he go? How did he go from designing these very intricate, kind of detailed, modernist, concrete heavy dwellings like the one in the tube house, to designing housing that is much simpler, almost, yeah, to say childlike is a bit silly, but you wouldn't expect this of a world famous architect. I mean, this is how, you know, anyone could draw a house. It's not what you would expect from a world famous architect. But of course, this is also showing his maturity. He's understanding what can be built, and he's focusing on urban design. He's not just obsessing over the architecture, but he's focusing on urban design. And, how did that change happen? And I think this is something that I would like to do more work on in the future, but is to now overlap his housing timeline with the other projects that he did, but also his planning ideas, because it's very much influenced by his notions of planning and his ideas of what a city could be. All of that has helped him kind of move away from, projects that in the initial period were very section heavy to projects increasingly towards the later period, which were very much based on the plan. And the idea that, the ideal house, you multiply it by 10,000 times, does not create the ideal community. So his obsession in the last 2, 3 decades was very much about affordable cities. And this is going to be a very quick segment because planning could be a whole lecture, but his basic point was that you cannot create affordable housing in a vacuum. He says it's a direct result of the correlation between the pattern of public transport and employment distribution in the city. So this tripartite relationship between housing, jobs, and public transport is what he realizes is the crux, is the really the issue that one should deal with. And that's what he tries to do in Mumbai, city where he lived and worked, of course, is how do you create more land? If you have squatter settlements, you can't solve the problem only by designing good housing. You need to design housing that interlocks with the jobs that people need. And if it doesn't interlock directly with a job that people need, but then interlocks with the public transport so that they can get to the job easily. Because people, obviously, as he says, very often don't move to cities for housing, they move for jobs. So you need to understand their problem rather than only obsess over the architecture of the housing. And that's what he was looking at in Mumbai. Mumbai is a city that is an island city that's basically north-south, and all the jobs are located here. And the richer you are, the closer you are to staying down near where the downtown areas are, and land prices get progressively lower as you go higher, or as you go further northward, as this diagram suggests. And he said a way to counteract that would be to actually to stop obsessing over this north-south orientation and open up land to the east, because by doing that, you kind of move away from this north-south monocentric structure into a more polycentric system around the bay. So that this whole system, a bit like the Randstad in the Netherlands or the San Francisco Bay Area, could kind of distribute land and jobs and opportunities more evenly. So this is really a citizen-led project. It isn't commissioned by the government. It's him, Shirish Patel, and Praveena Mehta, who get together as young architects, younger than, I'm ashamed to say this, but younger than I am now. And they develop these ideas and they put forward this proposal. They managed to get it published in newspapers and in magazines, and it begins to garner attention and it begins to create a buzz. And people start to look at this idea of, yes, why don't we do this in Mumbai? Wouldn't that be a good idea? So after about 6 years of kind of proposing this idea and sitting on many kinds of committees and kind of advocating for this project, it finally does get accepted by the government. And the government does acquire a lot of land to actually build the city. And to kind of promote the ideas of the city, he also puts together a film, which I won't play right now in the interest of time, but it's available on YouTube. If you just write City on the Water, it's a film that he put together produced by the Films Division of India that outline it. And it really talks about how he envisions that this entire city could grow. And again, it's based on different stages. There's an idea of phase-wise development of what should be implemented in the city first, and how the city could grow over time. Again, it's based on public transport, which is something that he really understood as being central to the success of the city. I mean, think of London or New York without the tube or the subway. It's impossible. They work as cities because of public transport. And that's what he tried to introduce in New Bombay or Navi Mumbai as well. And that's essentially a diagram he made of what the public transport could look like. It's again a lecture in itself. Maybe the next time we're in Sylhet, I'll be happy to talk about New Bombay a bit more. But he really developed the city based on a polycentric urban system where the train lines are the absolute DNA of the project. And every time you build a train station, you develop a neighborhood around the train station. And that's what those nodes are about. And what's interesting to my mind, and I think a real tragedy, is that we know all about Lutyens' Delhi. Everyone talks about Lutyens' Delhi, which is this grand arrangement of avenues that quite honestly are quite inhuman. Same can be said of Chandigarh, which is really a city that's developed for the cars. I mean, this is 1930 or so, this is 1950s, and this is 1970s. But this is a city that is much more, or holds a lot more lessons for the problems we face today, because this is a city that's developed on the idea of public transport. It's not about the car, it's not about the grand avenues, but it's about creating mass rapid transport and using that to structure growth in the city. And miraculously, as an idea, it went through, and you see the plan of the city come together with those nodes that I was talking about. Eventually, it didn't work for many reasons. He ended up quitting. I mean, a city is a massive exercise, and the government wasn't implementing the core ideas of his scheme. So he protested and left after being the chief architect for a few years. But he did manage to build some housing in that city, but he moved away from the role of being the chief planner. And in that period, he became more and more a kind of spokesperson on human settlements, on planning, on the development in the third world. This is him participating in the first UN Habitat Conference. That's Moshe Safdie, that's Christopher Alexander. He became very well networked. Also, organizations like the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, of course, very well known in Bangladesh. There's a familiar face here, that's Islam, sitting with Correa at a conference in Dhaka in the mid-1980s. That's Paul Rudolph and Kenneth Frampton. So he was beginning to be very well networked, of course, internationally, invited to speak at many different conferences and councils and all of that, but speaking very much so increasingly also as a planner. And he put all these ideas together in a book called The New Landscape, where really it was making a plea to understand the larger picture. That's basically the central thesis of that book, is to understand not just the scale of what you do with housing, but how do you create the larger environment for that housing to kind of function and blossom. And in the mid-1980s or late 1980s, actually, because as a result of all this work that he was doing, not just as an architect, but also as a planner, he was appointed by the then Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, to be the chairman of the first National Commission on Urbanization. So this was a remarkable opportunity to now address scales at the biggest scale possible, to really look at the urbanization of India. So no longer just Mumbai, but to really look at how to structure growth, how to structure urbanization in a country that was rapidly urbanizing and needed guidance. And you can see just on the table of contents there, him being the chairman, but they looked at so many issues, all the way from the issues of housing, affordable housing, but looking at urban form, looking at energy, looking at transport systems, water, sanitation. It was a massive planning exercise. These are just fragments that come out of that document. They visited all the major states in India, all the major cities, but they identified growth centers that were the small and medium-sized towns. And they said that the attention should go there, not the big metros, but all the smaller towns. And if you were to develop them, then you could have more balanced development rather than only focus on Bangalore or Mumbai or New Delhi. And this is the very last project I'll show. This is, just to show you that the work of an architect or a planner can be long, and it can be requires a lot of patience. And even New Bombay, which was his baby in a way, never got realized in the way that he intended it. But right in the end, they did develop in New Bombay. This is, of course, that same city we were looking at. They did decide to develop a large chunk, a node called Ulve, along his ideas. And you see very much the kind of diagram that we saw earlier, where kind of railway stations and the railway line would structure growth in the city. You would have streets served by buses that kind of had this necklace pattern here, and in the middle came housing. So all of these became nodes, or all of these became community areas. That's a sketch of what that was intended to look like. And what's remarkable again is that there was an understanding of what people can afford and what is the kind of built form they can afford, all the way from mud and bamboo to walk-up apartments and more higher rise construction. Again, all of this, one can go into a lot of detail, but impossible to do it in one lecture. But just to show you that there was a lot of planning that went into all of this. Each of this is 1 square kilometer. So the screen we're looking at is 49 square kilometers. In fact, New Bombay is the largest planned city on the planet, and no one really knows about it. So it's a bit of a shame, and it's an area of study that I hope someone can pick up and look into in more detail. But that's the overall master plan of the project, and just a time lapse of now what it looks like. And this is the bridge. At some point, Subrata, you'll see that bridge come in. You were talking about the bridge just before we spoke. Now that's finally the bridge that's coming in there. That's going to interlock with this system here, and you have the railway lines here, and the buses will ply like that, and all the housing that will come in the middle. Out here is a new airport that's being developed by Zaha Hadid. So it's finally, after 50 years, going to get materialized, but he's not alive anymore to see it. But that's, again, the life of an architect or a planner. Things take time. So the last slide I'm just going to show is that really we're looking at a kind of context that is increasingly becoming urbanized, where the slum population is going to triple in the next 25, 30 years. So 2/3 of all future urbanization is going to be informal. So therefore, the informal urbanization that we see in Sylhet or Dhaka or Mumbai or Sao Paulo is no longer the marginal kind of fringe development that used to be discussed earlier. It's very much the mainstream, and it's very much going to be the focus and the center of where much of the building activity in the next 2 or 3 decades is going to take place. And I think that's where, looking at these numbers, I think that's where people living, working in places like South Asia and Africa and the developing world have a remarkable opportunity actually to address these issues. We are now at the forefront of actually being able to have a say in how this development will happen. And how this development will happen will determine and have ramifications and effects on the planet as a whole. So I think it's really an exciting period to be an architect in a place like India or Bangladesh or Africa, because you're now at the cutting edge. You're embedded in the context where all this growth is going to happen. So I think that's where the work of an architect like Correa or Doshi or Islam becomes essential, because they've already dealt with many of these issues. And therefore, through learning from their work, I think there's a lot of work that can be done. So I think, I'm just going to end with this slide, which is a quote by him from the 1970s, where he says, "We are only as big as the questions we address. And this, to my mind, is a central riveting fact of life for architects in the third world." This is an important point. It's not the size or the value of the projects we are working on, but the nature of the questions they raise and which we must confront. I think that's fantastic, because it tells you that it's not about money, it's not about size, it's not about budgets, and it's not about all those other things that architects seem to be concerned about, but it's about addressing the important issues. And I think in that sense, being in Bangladesh and realizing, the enormity of the issues there climate change, the need for affordable housing, that is both a challenge, but it's also really an opportunity. And I hope in that sense, Correa's work and the work of many other architects we don't even know of need to be revisited and looked at, because I think they hold still many answers that could provide at least some kinds of solutions to the problems we all face. But with that, I'm going to end. It's been very long. I'm very sorry it's gone overboard over time, but it's very difficult to compress his work and his kind of a portfolio in just an hour. So my apologies. I hope everyone is still awake. I know it's late in Bangladesh, but yeah, happy to have any questions if there are.
Thank you so much for your impressive storytelling. It's like really well organized, and most of the projects are quite familiar to the participants here, and they also would like to have some questions. And of course, learning from the book or learning from someone who worked on that issue is totally different. So we are really, really privileged to have you here.
From the university, it's I think there's a small fee. I don't know how much it is, but with a small fee, you can access all the archives, which is really fantastic. It's 6,000 drawings, reports, essays, videos, lots of lectures. So it's really his whole career on this portfolio. The hard copies, unfortunately, the real archives, the actual physical drawings and models are in London. This is also, I was really one of his last employees. So I worked there between 2008 and 2010, and the office shut in 2010.
Yeah.
And that's when we started the foundation. And yeah, at that time, there weren't many places in India where the material could go. Now there is at SEPT, they have created a space and put together some money to actually hold the archives of architects. So, you know, some people have been, like Hasmukh Patel's archives are at SEPT, and that expands hopefully to many more people in the future. But when Charles was looking at his archives, there wasn't a venue in India that could look after 6,000 drawings, because you need, of course, special conditions of keeping those drawings. It can't just be left in a room. So eventually it was a discussion between MIT, where he taught obviously for many years, and the RIBA. And finally, they decided on the RIBA. So it's all there. So if anyone's ever in London, you can just go to the RIBA and request for a specific document, or get the working drawings of Kanchenjunga or Belapur. It's all there. But the digital copies are all available on this platform.